In the land of Egypt, during the reign of a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, the descendants of Israel had multiplied greatly. What began as a family of 66 souls who had come to Egypt during the great famine had grown into a mighty nation. Yet this growth stirred fear in the heart of the Egyptian king, who looked upon the Israelites with suspicion and dread. The Pharaoh spoke to his people, saying that the children of Israel had become too numerous and too mighty for the Egyptians. He feared that in time of war, they might join Egypt's enemies and fight against the land that had sheltered them. They began the bitter oppression of God's chosen people. The Egyptians set taskmasters over the Israelites, afflicting them with heavy burdens. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage, forcing them to build the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses with mortar and brick, and compelling them to labor in the fields under the scorching sun. But the more the Egyptians afflicted them, the more the Israelites multiplied and grew. This increase only deepened Pharaoh's anxiety, leading him to command the Hebrew midwives to kill all male children born to Israelite women. Yet the midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, and they allowed the male children to live. When questioned, they told Pharaoh that Hebrew women were more vigorous than Egyptian women and gave birth before the midwives could arrive. Seeing that his plot had failed, Pharaoh issued a cruel decree to all his people. Every son born to the Hebrews must be cast into the river Nile, while the daughters might live. It was into this world of oppression and infanticide that Moses was born. A man from the house of Levi had taken a wife from among his own tribe, and she conceived and bore a son. When the woman saw that her child was beautiful and healthy, she hid him for 3 months, keeping him safe from Pharaoh's murderous command. But as the child grew, it became impossible to conceal him any longer. The sound of his cries would surely betray his presence to the Egyptian authorities. Driven by desperate love and faith, the mother took a basket made of bulrush reeds and carefully coated it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof. She placed her precious son inside this makeshift vessel and set it among the reeds at the river's edge, while his sister Miriam watched from a distance to see what would become of him. Providence guided the events of that day, for Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, accompanied by her maidens who walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to fetch it. Opening the basket, she found the child crying, and her heart was moved with compassion. Though she recognized him as one of the Hebrew children, she took pity on him. At that moment, Miriam approached boldly and asked if the princess would like her to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. When Pharaoh's daughter agreed, Miriam quickly brought the child's own mother. The princess instructed the woman to nurse the child and promised to pay her wages. Through God's providence, Moses was raised by his own mother while being protected under the authority of Pharaoh's household. When the child was weaned, his mother brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses, meaning drawn out, because she had drawn him out of the water. Moses grew up in the royal palace, educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and trained in the ways of leadership and warfare. Despite his privileged position, Moses never forgot his true heritage. When he had grown to manhood, he went out to observe his brethren and witness their heavy burdens. His heart burned with righteous anger as he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Looking around and seeing no one watching, Moses struck down the Egyptian and buried him in the sand, thinking his deed had gone unnoticed. The next day, Moses went out again and found 2 Hebrew men fighting with each other. When he tried to intervene and ask the aggressor why he was striking his fellow Hebrew, the man responded defiantly, asking who had made Moses a prince and judge over them. Then he spoke the words that chilled Moses' heart. "Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses realized that his action had become known, and when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Fearing for his life, Moses fled from Egypt and journeyed to the land of Midian. There, weary from travel, he sat down by a well to rest. As he waited, 7 daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, came to draw water for their father's flock. But shepherds arrived and drove them away from the well. Moses rose up in defense of the women and helped them water their flock. When the daughters returned home earlier than usual, their father asked how they had finished their work so quickly. They told him about the Egyptian who had delivered them from the shepherds and had drawn water for their animals. Jethro invited Moses to share a meal with them, and Moses agreed to stay with the family. In time, Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage, and she bore him a son whom he named Gershom, meaning stranger. For Moses said he had been a stranger in a foreign land. For 40 years Moses lived as a shepherd in Midian, tending Jethro's flocks and learning the ways of the wilderness. During this time the Pharaoh of Egypt died, but his successor continued the harsh oppression of the Israelites. Their groaning and crying rose up to God, who remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The time of deliverance was drawing near. One day while Moses was tending the flock near Horeb, the mountain of God, an extraordinary sight captured his attention. A bush was burning with fire, yet it was not consumed by the flames. Curious about this marvel, Moses turned aside to investigate this great sight and understand why the bush did not burn up. When God saw that Moses had turned aside to look, he called to him from the midst of the bush, saying, "Moses, Moses." Moses responded, "Here I am." God commanded him not to come closer and to remove his sandals, for the ground on which he stood was holy. Then the voice identified itself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face, afraid to look upon God. The Lord declared that he had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt and had heard their cry because of their taskmasters. He knew their sorrows and had come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them to a good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. God had chosen Moses to go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. Moses was overwhelmed by this commission and protested his inadequacy, asking who he was to go before Pharaoh and lead Israel out of Egypt. God assured him of his presence and gave him a sign. After bringing the people out of Egypt, they would serve God on this very mountain. When Moses asked what name he should give, when the Israelites asked who had sent him, God revealed his eternal name. "I am who I am." He was to tell them that I am had sent him, the God of their fathers, who would be remembered by this name throughout all generations. Still hesitant, Moses worried that the people would not believe him or listen to his voice. God then performed miraculous signs to authenticate Moses' mission. He instructed Moses to cast his rod on the ground, and it became a serpent, causing Moses to flee from it. When God told him to take it by the tail, it became a rod again in his hand. Then God commanded Moses to put his hand inside his cloak, and when he withdrew it, his hand was leprous, white as snow. When he put it back and withdrew it again, it was restored to normal. Moses continued to resist, claiming he was not eloquent and was slow of speech. God reminded him that he had made man's mouth and could make him speak effectively. Still, Moses pleaded for God to send someone else. This angered the Lord, but he appointed Aaron, Moses' brother, to be his spokesman. Aaron would speak for Moses, and Moses would be like God to Aaron, telling him what to say. Taking his wife and sons, Moses began the journey back to Egypt, carrying the rod of God in his hand. Along the way, God met him at an inn and sought to kill him because he had not circumcised his son. Zipporah quickly took a sharp stone, circumcised their son, and touched Moses' feet with the foreskin, saying he was a bloody husband to her. After this, God let Moses alone. Meanwhile, God had spoken to Aaron in Egypt, commanding him to go into the wilderness to meet Moses. The brothers met at the mountain of God, where Moses told Aaron all that the Lord had commanded and the signs he was to perform. Together they returned to Egypt and gathered all the elders of the children of Israel. Aaron spoke the words that the Lord had given to Moses and performed the signs before the people. When the Israelites heard that the Lord had visited them and seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. Moses and Aaron then went to Pharaoh and declared, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh responded arrogantly, asking who the Lord was, that he should obey his voice and let Israel go. He declared that he did not know the Lord and would not let Israel go. Pharaoh's heart hardened further, and he commanded the taskmasters to no longer provide straw for the Israelites to make bricks, yet they must maintain the same quota of bricks as before. The people scattered throughout Egypt to gather stubble for straw, but they could not meet their quotas. The Hebrew foremen were beaten when the daily requirements were not met. When the foreman complained to Pharaoh, he accused them of being idle and wanting to go sacrifice to their God. Frustrated and angry, they confronted Moses and Aaron, blaming them for making their situation worse. Moses cried out to the Lord, asking why he had brought trouble upon his people and why he had sent him at all, since Pharaoh had only increased their suffering. God reassured Moses that he would now show Pharaoh his mighty hand, and with a strong hand, Pharaoh would let the people go. God renewed his covenant promises, reminding Moses that he was the Lord who had appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had heard the groaning of the Israelites and would deliver them with great judgments, making them his people and being their God. Though Moses spoke these words to the Israelites, they would not listen because of their anguish and cruel bondage. God then commanded Moses to speak to Pharaoh again, but Moses protested that if his own people would not listen to him, how would Pharaoh, especially since Moses was of uncircumcised lips? What followed was a supernatural contest between the power of God and the magic of Egypt. Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh, and Aaron cast down his rod, which became a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians threw down their rods, and they also became serpents, but Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them. God then brought 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, each demonstrating his power over the false gods of the Egyptians. The first plague turned all the water in Egypt to blood, making it undrinkable and killing the fish. The second plague brought frogs throughout the land, covering every surface and entering every home. The third plague brought lice from the dust of the earth, afflicting both man and beast. When Pharaoh's magicians could not replicate this plague, they acknowledged, "This is the finger of God." The fourth plague sent swarms of flies throughout Egypt, but the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. The fifth plague brought a severe pestilence upon the livestock of the Egyptians, while the animals of the Israelites remained healthy. The sixth plague caused painful boils to break out on the Egyptians and their animals. The seventh plague brought devastating hail mixed with fire, destroying crops and killing those caught in the open. Pharaoh seemed to relent, confessing his sin and asking Moses to pray for the hail to stop. But his heart hardened again once the plague ceased. The eighth plague brought locusts that devoured every remaining green thing in the land. The ninth plague brought a darkness so thick it could be felt, lasting 3 days throughout Egypt, while the Israelites had light in their dwellings. Before the final plague, God commanded Moses to institute the Passover. Each Israelite family was to take a lamb without blemish, kill it at twilight on the 14th day of the first month, and apply its blood to the doorposts and lintel of their homes. They were to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, dressed and ready to travel. This would be the Lord's Passover, for he would pass through Egypt that night and strike all the firstborn. But when he saw the blood, he would pass over those houses. At midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's firstborn, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. There arose a great cry throughout Egypt, for there was no house where someone had not died. That very night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and commanded them to take the Israelites and leave Egypt immediately, asking them also to bless him. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the land, fearing they would all die. The Israelites took their dough before it was leavened, carrying their kneading bowls wrapped in their clothes on their shoulders. They also asked their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver, gold, and clothing, and the Lord gave them favor so that their requests were granted. They plundered the Egyptians as they departed. The children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, along with a mixed multitude and many livestock. The time they had dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, and on that very day all the armies of the Lord went out from Egypt. God led the people not by the way of the Philistines, though it was shorter, because he knew they might change their minds and return to Egypt if they faced immediate warfare. Instead, he led them by way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the children of Israel swear to carry his remains back to the promised land. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel both day and night. When Pharaoh was told that the people had fled permanently rather than going for a 3-day worship journey, his heart and the hearts of his servants changed toward the Israelites. They regretted letting their slaves go and prepared to pursue them. Pharaoh made ready his chariot and took his army with him, including 600 chosen chariots and all the chariots of Egypt, with captains over everyone. The Egyptians pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth before Baal-zephon. When the Israelites saw the Egyptian army approaching, they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They complained bitterly to Moses, asking if there were no graves in Egypt that he had brought them to die in the wilderness. They accused him of deceiving them, saying it would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Moses answered the people with words of faith and courage. "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." The Lord commanded Moses to lift up his rod and stretch out his hand over the sea to divide it, so the children of Israel could go through on dry ground. The angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, moved behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them, coming between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The cloud gave light to Israel, but brought darkness to the Egyptians, so neither group came near the other all night. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all night, making the sea into dry land. The waters were divided, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, with the waters forming walls on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them into the midst of the sea with all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen. In the morning watch, the Lord looked down upon the Egyptian army through the pillar of fire and cloud and troubled their host. He took off their chariot wheels, making them drive heavily. The Egyptians recognized that the Lord was fighting for Israel against them and decided to flee. But the Lord commanded Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea again, so the waters would return upon the Egyptians. Moses did so, and as the sea returned to its full depth at daybreak, the Egyptians fled into it. The Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, and the waters covered the chariots, horsemen, and all Pharaoh's army that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them remained alive. The children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, with the waters as walls on both sides. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When the people witnessed this great work that the Lord had done against the Egyptians, they feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang a song of triumph to the Lord, celebrating his victory over their enemies and his faithfulness to his people. Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing, singing, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." The great Exodus had begun, but the journey to the Promised Land would test the faith and obedience of God's people through 40 years of wilderness wandering. Moses, the shepherd of Israel, would lead them through trials and tribulations, receiving the law at Mount Sinai, and guiding them until his death within sight of the land flowing with milk and honey. His life stands as a testament to God's power to use ordinary people for extraordinary purposes, transforming a stammering shepherd into the great lawgiver and deliverer of his chosen people. If this story has spoken to you, do subscribe to this channel, leave a like and comment, and also share with someone that might need a word of encouragement today.